I am an African.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Africa for Dummies show, where we discuss all things Africa. My name is Nathan, joined as always by Zenge. So, as you know, a lot of crazy stuff has been happening within the last couple of weeks, but one word sticks out.
Why were they whacked with a tariff?
China is hitting back on President Trump's tariff hike, saying, they're raising tariffs on the U.S. imports as well.
China slapping a new tariff on the United States.
With China, as you know, against my statement, they put a 34% tariff on above what their ridiculous tariffs were already.
Tariffs. Now, as an average economics student, I feel qualified to speak about this topic. So, tariffs, what are they? Tariffs are like a tax on imported goods to protect local industries. It's like your country grows rice, but your neighbor sells it cheaper. So the government adds a tax to the cheap rice to make your local rice look like a better deal. So what's all the hoopla about, and why is everyone talking about tariffs? Well, because current US President Donald Trump, aka the Donald, did this.
European Union, they're very tough. Vietnam, Taiwan, Japan.
Now, that video that we just saw is really important. Not only did the US hit the world with tariffs, but China just hit the US with tariffs as well. So the US throws tariffs and China throws them right back. It's a full-on trade war. And while these two are ducking it out like heavyweight boxers, somehow, some way, Africa found a way to catch a stray.
There's a lot of debate around how we, break the ties from the dependency of importation and, dependency on other regions on Africa's economic future. So some doom and gloom, but I think there is some, it's not all negative. I think it's just really a moment in time where a lot of African leaders and business people and investors are figuring out what we can do to increase our own productivity, our own resilience, our own economies.
Now, in this video, we're going to be talking about the countries that are most affected by these tariffs. And some of the countries on this list are going to be a shocker. Because first on the list is Madagascar.
I like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. Yeah, I like to move it.
No, Madagascar, yes, the country, the homeland of King Julian. I literally was this. I was this years old when I figured out what Madagascans look like, and they do not look like King Julian at all. So Madagascar just got slapped with almost 50% tariffs, and I know what you're thinking. It's those damn penguins again.
Progress report. It's an older code, Skipper. I can't make it out.
This time, not at all.
A bit about that.
Yeah. The way it was like looked like a crazy formula, but then basically it came down to a trade deficit. So if your country had a larger trade deficit with the US, then boom, you get hit with a tariff, like a crazy tariff. Generally, most countries were hit with 10%, but if your trade deficit with the US was much higher, in Donald Trump's mind, it means that the US is losing to you and they hit you.
So I have to ask, after this is a stupid question, but what exactly is a trade deficit? How do you indicate?
That's a very good question, right? So a trade deficit is basically something like when a country imports way more than it exports. So if the US is buying way more stuff from you than you're buying from them, then you have a trade deficit, right? And according to Donald Trump, he wants America first, right? So if there's a larger trade deficit with a country, then basically you get hit with a higher tariff. Now, the issue is there are countries that just have a competitive advantage in producing certain things than others, meaning that in certain products, the US might be a loser in because they don't have the ability to manufacture or produce that product, right? So you would expect that, like in the case of Madagascar, which exports a lot of vanilla and also clothes as well, and doesn't import that much stuff from the US. Maybe it could be a geographical reason. It imports more stuff from China. They got hit with the highest amount of tariffs on the African continent. And second on that list is actually Lesotho, a country not many people know about because the image that just showed up on your screen is not Lesotho, but this is Lesotho. Lesotho just got hit with 40% hike, with a 40% hike in tariffs as well, which is wild for a country that's landlocked, small, and peaceful. right? Nobody knows much about Lesotho. Like Lesotho doesn't even make the news unless, of course, you have a trade
Lesotho is
deficit
famous
with the
for,
red, white, and blue.
yeah.
Sorry.
Lesotho is famous for uh the outfits that they wear, the blankets, which are like designed for
Ah, right, right, right,
high
right.
climate. Lesotho is a very high climate area. It's AKA the Mountain Kingdom
Mm-hmm.
because it's got lots of mountains. And then also another interesting fun fact, which could be a podcast in itself. Lesotho provides water to South Africa. Like it's South Africa is very
Really?
reliant on Lesotho for water. Um, I think 60% of South Africa's biggest province in terms of economic power. So where Johannesburg is, where Pretoria is, it's a province called Gauteng. Uh, 60.
Gauteng.
I might get the facts wrong, but almost half or around half of the water supply to that province comes from Lesotho, because they make like tons of dams and then they supply
Ah,
water to South Africa.
okay.
Yeah,
That's
that's just my
crazy.
little tangent. So for those who don't
Wait,
know Lesotho,
dumb
some
question.
fun facts.
Drinking water or
And it's a
water
kingdom.
like
It's one of
just?
the three kingdoms. No, it's all types of water. Like
Ah, okay.
um yeah, so including drinking water, including sanitary water, those types of things.
I
Yeah,
see. That's
yeah.
crazy.
So and it's also a
Yeah.
monarchy. It's the only one of three monarchies in Africa. It's a constitutional monarchy, unlike Iswatini, the more famous one, which is an absolute monarchy. So the king has less powers. Basically, they have a prime minister
Mm,
who's the powerful guy.
crazy. And they're actually a major exporter of clothes as well. T-shirts, jeans, jackets. A
And
whole
the
lot
big
of stuff
three
that was
brands is
headed to.
Levi, Nike,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
I think Ralph Lauren as
No,
well,
not
maybe.
Nike.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so basically, all those things are going to be more expensive for the US. Again, Lesotho is a country that doesn't really import much from the United States. As you can imagine, it's literally surrounded by South Africa. So most of its imports are going to come from South Africa or the neighboring countries, right? And moving on to our next country, which is Botswana, right? And Botswana just got a good old lesson in Trumponomics, because it turns out diamonds do not last forever, right? If you didn't get that, Botswana is a big exporter of diamonds, and they export a lot of diamonds to the U.S. and the U.S. now slaps a tariff on them, and so diamonds are also, well, for American citizens, are about to get really really expensive, right?
But this goes to
And
the thing that you said before,
yep.
like comparative advantage. How much
Hmm.
diamonds does America produce for them to
That's
fill
a good
that gap?
question.
Like,
Exactly.
there's just some things that America probably doesn't have.
Exactly. It doesn't. It's sometimes it doesn't really make sense, because it's like, wait, of course you're going to have a trade deficit with this country. You don't manufacture that. That it's literally an example of Lesotho and South Africa. It's like South Africa getting mad at Lesotho, like, why did you guys have so much water? Like, like I'm gonna slap a tariff on you guys because you guys, you guys are giving
Yeah,
us water, right? And
yeah. And the
yeah,
main
so
main
as well.
import. So as you just
Mhm.
checking some of the like stats, the main top origins for imports into Lesotho come from South Africa, China, Chinese
Mhm.
Taipei, which is also known as Taiwan. Interesting, and
Interesting.
Japan and India. So United States is not there
Hmm.
in the
And
tariff.
yeah, exactly. So again, this is another country that doesn't import a lot from the United States, and I think the reason why a lot of people are getting stuff from China is because, of course, the cost of production in the U.S. is much higher than in China, right? Particularly, of course, labor cost, which brings in a whole argument of ethical issues. But I mean, things from China are generally cheaper than things from the United States. Hence, why a lot of countries, particularly poor countries in Africa, are getting stuff from there. Now, yeah, speaking about diamonds, so, literally nearly $500 million of diamonds is now subject to 40% in tariffs, right? So this is going to hurt a lot of rappers who wear a lot of iced out chains, and they might have to switch and start wearing those macaroni necklaces that kids make in kindergarten. And yeah, so it's a lot of crazy stuff going on in with the diamonds as well with Botswana, and finally, of course, the last country that's just been slapped by the United States in Africa, which is definitely on the top of Donald Trump's list, is South Africa. South Africa, a country that not only was had its funding or aid taken away from it, the ambassador got recently got
Yes,
kicked out.
Africa's had a very bad year.
Precisely, precisely. So Mzanzi, as it's known locally, just got hit with a 30% tariff, and the Amapiano Nation exports to the U.S. I was actually shocked to see this, but they export cars as well. So wine, citrus, among a plethora of other things, right? All of it also just got slapped with 30% tariff. So that makes life a little bit harder for Ramaphosa in South Africa. And again, South Africa doesn't import that, it imports from the US, but not as much. Hence, it got a lesser tariff than the other countries that were mentioned. So, in conclusion, what we see is jeans, diamond suits, and cars, amongst other things, are about to get a lot more expensive for US consumers. And that's not just bad news for shoppers. It could seriously reduce demand and revenue for African countries that rely on these exports. Now, many nations were already scrambling to adjust to the US tariff. Then, boom, China just recently retaliated. Again, your question might be, how does that affect Africa? Well, a lot of African economies depend on exporting to countries like China and the US. But here's the catch: the US is also a huge buyer of Chinese products. So if China takes a financial hit, it may have less money to spend on the African raw materials, which means shrinking markets and shrinking opportunities. Some of these new tariffs have been paused for now, but the tariffs on China still standing strong. And in any case, one thing is clear: no one really wins in a trade war. The big players throw punches, and it's the local workers, the farmers, the factory workers who feel the pain. Zenga, do you have anything else to add to that? Sorry.
Yeah, no, I feel like you've covered a lot of
Yeah.
how complex this thing is. Um, but I think there's also like an interesting aspect of the trade dynamics. Um, and you can see that so I'm just pulling out my little map. So trade in according to a map by these visual capitalist guys, and they normally source them from quite reputable sources. I'll mention the source
Mhm.
later. So in the year 2000, U.S. trade totaled. This is to the world. U.S. trade totaled like $2 trillion, more than 4 times that of China, which is 474 billion. That was in the year 2000.
Mhm.
And then from then up to 2024, the US trade expanded by 167%, whilst China's trade surged by 1,200%, which is ultimately surpassed the US in 2012. By 2024, total trade reached 5.3 trillion for the US and 6.2 trillion for China. So $5.3 trillion in terms of global trade from the US and
Wow.
$6.2 trillion from China. The majority of African countries, the majority. So listen, look at this. In the year 2000, the map of Africa in terms of those countries between the US and China, who's the bigger trading partner with these African countries, right? Um, the map had only Zambia, Tanzania, Djibouti, Sudan. That was the big Sudan at that time. It wasn't split up. Libya, Equatorial Guinea, Togo, Benin, Liberia, Guinea-Bissau, and Mauritania. Only those countries were had China as its largest trade partner. Only those countries.
Mhm.
That's less than 10 countries, if I counted correctly. In 2024, the map is fully red. Basically,
Mhm.
every single African country is trading more with China than it is with the United States in 2024. The only countries
Mhm.
that surpass this, the only countries where the United States is trading more, is the larger trading partner between China and the United States, is Lesotho and Eswatini. That's it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think
Those
China
are the only
has
two
really.
countries.
I watched somewhere that China likes the status quo, but the US sees that with the status quo, they might, go into the shadows, and China might emerge as the superpower. And that's something that the United States doesn't want to happen. So I think basically for many countries in Africa, we need to brace ourselves. And yeah,
I think
because clearly there's quite a bit of, yeah, go ahead.
I think an important thing also here is what type of mechanisms Africa has this agreement with the United States called the um, Africa Growth Opportunity Act, AGOA, which is a 25-year-old US program offering duty free access to African exports. This was the idea that African economies want to start looking at trade rather than aid. I'm talking about the concept, trade rather than aid. And then because we are sort of weaker countries, the US should give us some type of preferential treatment. But this also depends on your relationship, wider relationship with the United States. Like, for example, the Uganda was removed out of AGOA because the United States wasn't pleased with its domestic policies on LGBT rights, for example. So it's not purely just trade, but it's also your relationship with the United States. Anyway, the concept of AGOA was that you have some type of preferential agreement as an African country, developing African country with the United States. However, this puts AGOA somewhat into doubt. And some articles have even said it puts AGOA into a state of like an obsolete state. Like, what's the purpose now of AGOA when you're tariffing countries at 50%, Lesotho, Madagascar 47, South Africa at 30. And in South Africa, it would cost 0.3% of its GDP if all of this takes into full effect. And then in Madagascar, it threatens 60,000 jobs, human jobs, guys. Please, perception of Madagascar is not just King Julian. There's about 20 million people or so in Madagascar. Um, and in Lesotho, it would risk 12,000 jobs and 11 factory closures. So this will have a huge impact on unemployment. And once you have an impact on unemployment, it will have effects on everything else. Um, in countries that are less reliant on AGOA, they got much lighter tariffs. So 10% baseline tariff in Kenya. Um, but Kenya at the same time is also a closer ally, one of the key allies of the United States. And last year it was made a major non-NATO ally. So I don't think people are that surprised that Kenya has got lesser tariffs. Um, and as you said, like Africa is just catching strays. But how exactly can Africa make or try and take a leaf from this or take a signal? Intra-African trade. People have been crying about it for like 10 years, 15 years. The need for Africans to trade with each other. In 2023, inter-African trade, so trade between African countries, accounted for about 15% of Africa's total trade, which was up from 13.6% in 2022. Now, this is significantly lower than intra-regional trade in other countries such as Asia, Europe, which normally exceeds 50 and 70%, respectively. So I think it's important for Africa to start looking within its own means. People say Africa has no middle class and so on, but I think there is. I mean, the AFDB talked about middle class composing of somewhere between 20-ish percent. So 20% of 1.3 billion people is not a small number. And the more
Mhm.
you invest amongst each other, the bigger the middle class will grow. And people, so but it's interesting, that I'm seeing the debates on social media. Some people are saying China will sort of budge because the US is such a big market for China, and it's true. The US has
Yeah.
200 to 300 million people now, and that's a huge market with a high GDP per capita. So they have a strong purchasing power. So I don't think China can fully ignore, but I think they are big enough to
To
survive.
withstand. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
in terms of
I
their
mean,
size and
it's the
their
same thing. It's I think I was listening to someone who was saying that it's the same thing with Russia, that the
mm,
United States was sort of like expecting like Russia to just go into this collapse after they cut them off, essentially including Europe as well. But I mean, while
mm,
Russia has suffered quite a blow, I mean, it's still surviving to a certain
yeah.
degree, right? It's still pushing. And I think right now, if I'm not mistaken, China is now starting to kind of trying to woo Europe, trying to say, "Hey guys, like let's figure this out because these guys are clearly not somebody that we can." we can
Yeah, and
trust. I mean, they're the ones who set up the world system the way it is right now, the world financial system the way it is
exactly.
right now, and they're only sour
Mm.
because they're starting to notice a trend in the sense that they're falling behind in terms of manufacturing and XY, right? But then the
Yeah.
question also starts to come in, which is like, what sort of industries would the U.S. if the U.S. gets this done? What sort of industries would be coming back to the United States, right?
You know,
Because if it's car
Dave,
sorry, go ahead.
yeah, go ahead. I was just gonna say Dave Chappelle made a joke about that. I don't know what date that was, but it seemed quite
Hmm.
relevant today. About he was like, I don't want to make any Nike shoes. I just want to buy them. It's like, does anyone want to make
Yeah,
any Nike shoes? Yeah, like I just want to buy them.
yeah,
Let
yeah,
China make it. So yeah, go ahead.
yeah.
You're saying car manufacturing.
No, but I was going to say, I mean, if you look at, I mean, a big debate right now, especially in Europe, because Germany's Europe's superpower, and sorry, Germany's Europe's superpower, and mainly Germany relies on car manufacturing, right? And China, and right now the trend with car manufacturing is moving into, more less climate friendly cars, which are e-cars,
Electronic.
right?
Yeah.
Electronic cars, right? And the US, I mean, while Germany has been trying to produce these cars, I mean, as you can imagine, Germany has a higher labor cost as well, higher cost
Hmm.
of production. Um, eh, China is literally producing, arguably, from what I hear, some people would disagree, arguably better e cars for half the price. Like, I think if I'm not
Yeah.
mistaken, BYD is actually not allowed to be sold here. I don't know if, but I saw a BYD thing.
You
But
know what?
I think they're also subject to tariffs or something like that, which makes their
Yeah.
cars even way more expensive. But
Yeah.
it's like literally, yeah.
Yeah, it's an incredible segue because, like here, in Ethiopia, there is so many electric cars. It is insane. Um, yeah, people. That's the last thing people think about in Ethiopia. But there's
Hmm.
lots of electric cars, and the government policy is very pro electric cars. There's much
Hmm.
more taxes in buying gas and petrol cars. So, and Ethiopia is a very traditional ally of. Um, China, and so you know it's insane how much China can produce at increasingly good quality. Um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, and the interesting thing is that I saw a talk between I was just about to say Tim Apple. His name is Tim Cook because Trump gave him that name,
Tim
and now
Cook, right?
it sticks. Yeah, the CEO of Apple, and he was having this talk, and I'm slightly paraphrasing here. He was basically someone was asking him, "Why don't you build in America? Why don't you have factories in America?" He said, "No, you see, we've been asked this question many times, but the truth about China is there is a increasingly high amount of skill and capacity." And a lot
Hmm.
of it, like a lot of it. Whereas in America, it's
Hmm.
less and more expensive, right? You can
Hmm.
like so this is not only just about just cheap labor, it's also about skilled labor that is affordable.
Skilled, yeah.
You can have the
Economies of
same
scale as
skills in
well.
China
Like
for
they,
less than you.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
And I think for yeah, so economies of scale is just about how big it can be, right? For those who are not
Hmm.
economists.
Well,
I'm just
that wasn't
clarifying with you though.
that wasn't necessary. But anyways,
Yeah,
what I was
I'm
just
not an economist, but I need to be spoken to like a 5-year-old on these things. All right,
no,
so
no. Yeah, that's definitely me. I mean, if I can give a personal example, if you allow me to, as somebody who's also, people say I have ADHD, so there's A4D. I also have other side projects that I'm I'm trying to do. But
yeah,
one of them is basically where we're trying to, work with Internet of Things, IoT, trying to like. So we had the idea of trying to manufacture our own sort of sensors, right? And we did everything we could to make sure that this was the cheapest sort of sensor version of the sensor that we could make, right? Still didn't come close to China. It didn't even come close to China. So you really can't beat them at that, aspect.
there's just something about the components that China does well.
Yeah, and okay, can I ask you a question, right? Before we close, what do you think? Because
Yeah,
clearly we are sort of entering. Would you agree that we're entering into a new financial world order? Right. That's my
yeah.
first question. And second question would be, how do you think Africa needs to pivot? Well, I think Africa is a big term. So let's just start with SADC, for example, right? And to all my
The Southern
non-SADC
African
people, I
Development
apologize, but
Corporation.
pardon me.
The Southern
Yeah,
African
so just looking at, okay, let's not even do SADC, right? We're Zambian, so let's say Zambia. How do you think a country like Zambia needs to pivot in order to prepare itself for this new financial world order,
I
if there is one coming, a new one?
Yeah, I think, look, I think this, as you said before, it's like a battle between two giants. And the typical African saying is when two elephants fight, the grass is trampled on. Now, how do we convert
Hmm,
small, sort of weaker economies in Africa from being trampled on grass to more like mice that can sort of run between the legs and not die? Uh,
hmm,
so I think uh, when it comes to Zambia, particularly, Zambia was hit with 17% of tariffs and one of the lowest among AGOA
oh wow,
beneficiaries. Zambia is
that's
an AGOA beneficiary. And
okay.
considering that US exports account for just 1.2%, 2.6% of Zambia's total exports, so something like 196 to 90, 92 to $96 million, that is not a lot of money even for a country like Zambia. All right. So most people will be like, yeah, what's the fuss? But if we zoom out in 2023, Zambia's economy leaned heavily on a few single high value commodities. So raw copper, $6.9 billion, refined copper, 2.3, gold, 8.5 billion, and precious stones like emeralds, which, lots of celebrities have started wearing these days. So where is it all
Hmm.
going? Now, if you look at Zambia's major export destinations, most people would never guess that our largest export destination is Switzerland, $4.6
All right,
billion, followed by China. Don't ask me why Switzerland, because that's a whole different episode to discuss
it's
on.
a whole documentary.
China
There's actually a
comes
documentary
second.
about it.
India
Yeah.
and I still don't get the documentary, so that's why we're gonna do an episode on it later. In India, India and the UAE come right behind. So Zambia isn't relying necessarily on AGOA for survival, right? AGOA affects, actually, AGOA, I think AGOA will mostly impact a lot of small, medium scale, particularly women owned businesses who
Hmm.
sell maybe crafts, textiles, and numerous other sort of sustainable merchandise. Um, so
Hmm.
it's not a lot. Um,
Hmm.
and I think, what did I see? Coffee, and soybeans was a big component of what Zambia exports to the United States. Um, yeah, coffee and soybeans, and yeah, coffee and soybeans. So when it comes to this, now China is one of our biggest export destinations, and we also have quite a large portion of our debt, bilateral debt wise, it's the biggest bilateral debt we have. Although most of Zambia's debt is to IMF and sort of private bondholders. So when the US hits China with 145% tariff, China's economy slows down, and when China slows down, its appetite for copper also drops, which will significantly affect Zambia's economy, which relies on the price of copper. That directly hits Zambia's top earners, even without touching a single Zambian product. So there's a sense of domino effect and collateral damage.
Yeah.
And even though Zambia and many other African countries with a similar economic makeup like Zambia uh, will not be eh, on the battlefield, but they will be sort of in the blast radius. But a key takeaway here is that Zambia has to diversify its trade partners. One of the growing areas of
Sure.
trade, the growing new great trade partners in Zambia include countries like India, even
Hmm.
countries like Saudi Arabia. South Africa has consistently been growing, but South Africa is also hit by these things.
Being
So
hit by.
not only U.S. tariffs on China, but U.S. tariffs on South Africa would also impact Zambia's capacity to trade. So diversify trade partners, adding value to raw exports to get more for what you're exporting.
Yeah.
Um, and then
Precisely.
also investing in regional trade like the AFCTA. AFCTA, I think Zambia has ratified it. It's basically this broad based African single market. a single market of 1.3 billion people and almost $3 trillion in combined GDP as an African continent. So we should start investing in value addition of our exports. Some countries like Indonesia, and I had this nice conversation
Yeah,
with this guy on
I
X
feel like that's
about,
the age old song, isn't it?
yeah, but what does value
I've heard
addition
value
mean?
addition
Like
since I was a
people
child.
always say, I know, yeah, like that
Yeah.
stuff just bothers me sometimes. But it's like those people who say land linked Zambia, and like 2 weeks, 2 days ago, there was a
Mm.
land linked conference. It's like, wasn't this discussed in 2001? You know, uh,
Yeah. Yeah, so that's pretty much it with regards to tariffs and how they're going to affect Africa. Thank you so much for joining us. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, everything. Be sure to leave us a rating if you're listening to this on Spotify or any other podcasting platforms. And as always, thank you so much for joining us and see you guys on the next episode.
I am an African.